Okay, thank you very much to Roberto Mazzina for his introduction, and to Tullio Giraldi also for his introduction and for bringing me here to Trieste. It's my second time here. I was here, as Roberto said, I was here 4 years ago at a wonderful conference in the big lecture theatre dedicated to Franco Basaglia. It was a great pleasure to be here, even though it was snowing. It was quite a different environment than it is today. They told me it never snowed in Trieste, so just don't listen to experts. So my question today for this talk, does psychopharmacology have a future? Well, maybe for the audience who have been here at the previous conferences, it's not such an absurd question because you've heard a lot about alternatives to psychopharmacology. But in some way, as we will see, I hope, in the presentation, it is a strange question at least, because psychopharmacology certainly has an incredibly powerful presence in our world today. The use of psychiatric drugs is certainly not in decline, as I'll show in a moment. And it's not just that psychiatric drugs are used in psychiatric institutions and for treating people with psychiatric problems who come to see their general practitioners. They're used in a whole range of practices, and they become integral to the management of mental states and of human conduct in our world today. In fact, it's quite hard to imagine a world without these drugs. And indeed, for some at least, the future looks quite promising. There are many new markets to exploit as the developing countries, the so-called BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India and China, are opened up as new markets for psychiatric drugs to be sold in. And there are many new problems that seem to be available for being addressed by drugs. Of course, the future huge increases that are predicted in Alzheimer's disease and dementia. The fact of many people living into old age increases the number of people who are diagnosed with Parkinson's, and the dream, at least for some, of using drugs for cognitive enhancement. But what I want to show today is that this future, which some people think looks bright, is not quite the future that was dreamed of back in the 1980s. Where psychiatric drugs were routinely thought of as precise, specific, and directed towards very precise targets based on an understanding of the brain. So what I want to look at today is whether there is a future for psychopharmacology and what kind of future it might be, and whether or not a new dream is beginning to take shape, one that Tullio mentioned, the dream of personalized medicine based on brain signatures arising from a new strategy of doing research into the brain. But just before we talk about the future, let's have a little look at the present here. So these are data that will probably be quite familiar to you. This is the United Kingdom from 1998 to 2010, looking at the increases or otherwise of the use of psychiatric drugs. So down here we see the antipsychotics, which are definitely on the rise, but not very fast. Here we see the mood stabilizers. Here we see the anxiolytics and the hypnotics. There's often a view that people don't prescribe benzodiazepines and the other anxiolytics these days, but that is not the case. They're certainly keeping at a regular kind of rate here. And this, of course, you won't be surprised to see. This is the rise of prescriptions for the antidepressant drugs, the so-called antidepressant drugs. To take a different country, this is Australia. Again, in the 10 years from 2000 to 2011, you can see these are the different classes of drugs, which I won't go through. You won't be surprised to hear that this red line here, that is the increase in prescriptions of the antidepressants. If you look at this bar chart here, which is probably not so easy easy to read. This is again about the use of antidepressants. This is OECD figures. Again, here comparing 2000 and 2011. 2000 being these pale greens, 2011 being the dark greens here. This is Italy. These are defined daily doses per 1,000 people per day. You can see that there has been an increase, quite a considerable increase in the use of antidepressants in Italy. But you can see that Italy still has a long way to go if it's going to reach the level of prescribing even of the United Kingdom, which is down here, which uses half as much again as Italy, let alone little old Iceland, which seems to be racing away for reasons which might be interesting to discuss. This is the OECD average, and you can see Italy is below the OECD average. So these figures are commented again and again and again, and it's in particular, it's the rise of the drugs that are called antidepressants that we see in all these regions. Of course, we call these drugs antidepressants, but you will be aware, I'm sure, that although we make a distinction conventionally between the antidepressant drugs and the anti-anxiety drugs, these drugs, Prozac, and its brothers and sisters, sertraline, venlafaxine, and all the others, they are now increasingly prescribed for anxiety conditions like general anxiety disorder, as well as for depression. So what we're seeing is the use of these drugs again and again and again for a whole range of conditions. In my own country, in 2013, in England alone, over 53 million prescriptions for antidepressants were issued. The population of England is about 50 million, so that means at least one prescription for every inhabitant of England. These are figures for England, not the United Kingdom as a whole. Well, you won't be able to read these figures here, but this is from the United States. In fact, I can't even read them, but this is just indicating to you the top 25 drugs that are prescribed in the United States. You'll be interested to hear that the top drug that is prescribed about 50 million times in the United States in the last year of record is Xanax, which is a drug for anxiety. And if you look down here, all these drugs are anxiety drugs and antidepressant drugs prescribed in millions and millions of prescriptions, and all of them on the increase over the last years. Well, enough said. I mean, I think we're familiar enough with these figures to know that, in a certain sense, psychopharmacology has become a way of life. That is to say, in more and more circumstances, more and more people in more and more regions are routinely modulating, shaping, affecting, managing their moods, their desires, their feelings of happiness or sadness, their activity, their energy levels, managing these through drugs. And many non-psychiatric practices have also become highly dependent on the use of these drugs. In homes and wards for the elderly, where there are very high levels of prescription of antipsychotic drugs, I think almost everybody accepts that those drugs are prescribed in those homes for the elderly for reasons of control rather than for reasons of therapy. In prisons, there are very high uses of psychiatric drugs. In children's homes, there are high uses of psychiatric drugs, and so on. So somehow, psychopharmacology has become central to modern ways of life, which is why it might seem absurd to say or to ask whether psychopharmacology has a future. Because even with the kind of excellent developments that Tullio has pointed out today, with the rise of CBT, with the rise of psychological therapies, with a whole range of other non-pharmacological means, it's really difficult to imagine a world without these drugs. A world where all the circumstances in which all the people who are using all these millions and millions and millions of drugs are moving to another form of therapy. But, as I said at the beginning, what's happening today is not quite the dream that people had in the 1980s. the dream of specificity, the dream of targeting, the dream that one knew the mechanisms by which the drugs worked. One knew the mechanisms by which these disturbances of mood or emotion or desire, one knew the mechanisms by which these had become disturbed in individuals, one identified the targets, and one used the drug to rectify the molecular basis, the neuromolecular basis of these conditions. Here's the kind of image which you would have seen again and again and again if you were doing training in the 1980s around what was going on when people had a psychiatric disorder. What was going on was essentially going on in the gap, the cleft, the synaptic cleft, but in neurotransmission. The brain was thought of as an organ like any other organ. You could kind of anatomize this organ at a molecular level. You could break it down into its individual elements. These were neurons, these were ion channels, these were receptor sites, these were synapses. You could characterize the functioning of each of these elements within the neuromolecular system. And you could identify normal and abnormal variations in mood, in affect, in desire, in terms of variations in the functioning of these molecular elements. And then you could intervene, at least in your dreams, you could intervene to identify exactly what was the problem in each particular case and formulate the drug that would rectify that problem. You would manipulate the brain, not in the way in which we were familiar in the 1950s, us radical critics of psychiatry. These were not chemical koshes. These were not just used to stupefy people and to render them submissive. These were smart, targeted drugs that worked precisely upon the mechanisms. And indeed, if you happen to go to the website of Eli Lilly to look at how Prozac worked, you saw in these little cartoon-like simulations exactly how Prozac was supposed to work. What was depression? Oh, we all know depression is too little serotonin in the synaptic cleft. How does Prozac work? It works to increase the amount of serotonin in the synaptic cleft, and it does so in this cartoon showing you this. It does so by blocking the reuptake mechanism and therefore increasing the amount of serotonin in the synaptic cleft. And if you went and looked at any of the textbooks of psychopharmacology, for instance, this is from Stephen Stahl's textbook on psychopharmacology, again a little cartoon here. This is showing you exactly how an SSRI works. An SSRI works by locking itself into the receptor sites and preventing the reuptake of serotonin, therefore increasing the amount of serotonin in the synaptic cleft. Well, to be very simple about it, this imagination, this imaginary, as we might call it, about how the drugs worked, not just antidepressant drugs, but also antipsychotic drugs, schizophrenia, too much dopamine, depression, too little serotonin, how the drugs work to upgrade or downgrade the amount of these neurotransmitters in the synaptic cleft. This is a myth, not to put it too strongly. If these drugs work at all, and as Tullio said, the extent to which these drugs work at all is subject to considerable debate. If they work at all, they certainly do not work through this mechanism. This whole belief, this neurotransmitter hypothesis of psychiatric disorder, that grounded research and development in the drug companies for about 20 or 30 years has proven to be mistaken. This is not to say that there are no neurobiological mechanisms or correlates of psychiatric disorder, but this, which has informed the pathway of psychiatric drug development for such a long period, this is the myth that has proved not to be possible to turn into reality. Now, you don't have to take my word for this. 4 years ago, I think, the failure of this myth, the failure to realize this dream became entirely evident. This popular article gained quite a lot of publicity. Is Pharma running out of brainy ideas? And in this piece, the author showed that most pharmaceutical companies were beginning to disinvest in the development of psychiatric drugs. So this, which I put here on the right, this is an announcement which was in Science. I'll just read this out to you. In announcing the move to investors, the GSK chief executive, Andy Whitty, explained that pain, depression, and anxiety were areas where, quote, we believe the probability of success is relatively low, and we think the cost of attaining success is disproportionately high, close quote. Ceasing research in these areas would save GSK £250 million or $387 million by 2012. And GSK began to disinvest in research and development in the central nervous system. A few weeks later, news came that AstraZeneca was closing research facilities in the United States and Europe and ceasing drug discovery work in schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, depression, and anxiety. And here's another quote. The biggest problem isn't the announcements by GSK and AstraZeneca. It's when you look at the pipeline and see what companies are actually doing in psychiatric drug development. This is Thomas Insel speaking, director of the NIMH, the National Institute of Mental Health. When you look at the pipeline, you see that there are very few new molecular entities, very few novel ideas, and almost nothing that gives any hope for a transformation in the treatment of mental illness. Here's a whole series of other comments by the drug companies about why they are disinvesting their research. GSK has reduced its discovery research in psychiatry and pain. Explaining Glaxo's decision, its chief of medicine R&D told the Wall Street Journal that neuroscience research, quote, is currently one of those of highest risk for the industry. The identification of targets, the animal models, the nature of experimental medicine, and the development programs for these diseases are amongst the least predictive and most costly of any area. Neuroscience is many areas is very exciting, but in some areas it's not mature enough to make drug discovery efficient or effective. Another quote here. Neuroscience has largely been a burial ground for drug development, says Nigel Gaymond, chief of the UK's bioindustry, which is a lobby for biotechnology companies. Investors are now beginning to argue that drug companies should justify the amount of money that they're spending on R&D, and R&D productivity in the neurosciences has completely collapsed. Here's another pharmaceutical innovation in the 20th century. Neuropsychiatric disorders, including schizophrenia, depression, and Alzheimer's disease, are areas of enormous medical need. Yet despite the clear and compelling need for newer and better medications to treat these diseases, there's a paucity of innovation in this area. From a developmental standpoint, psychiatric diseases typically represent complex syndromes with multiple etiologies, and it's difficult to measure endpoints. Preclinical screens are poor because the product are often chronic, clinical studies are large, and protocols are costly and complex. What these drug company representatives are saying in so many words is that that very simple model which they had in the 1980s, it was all to do with the neurotransmitters, too much neurotransmitter, too little neurotransmitter, there's where the targets were, that's what you had to do, raise the level of serotonin, reduce the level of dopamine. That model simply has not worked. Steve Hyman, who was the predecessor of Thomas Insel as director of the National Institute of Mental Health, is a very good case example of this. And I'm going to just use a few of his comments because I think he shows how those very high hopes which were there as little as 15 years ago, have come to nothing. So this is a paper that he published in 2012. Revolution stalled, he says. Drug discovery is at a near standstill for treating psychiatric disorders such as schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, depression, and autism. Despite high unmet need, major pharmaceutical companies are de-emphasizing or exiting psychiatry, removing significant capacity from efforts to discover new medicines. And he goes on to say that in the period from 1993 to 2004, only 8% of CNS drugs, psychiatric drug candidates, that reached the stage of initial human testing, phase 1 testing, eventually achieved regulatory approval. The failure was sometimes to do with complexity, but more commonly because the drugs simply could not demonstrate that they were efficacious. And the more that regulators began to demand that the drugs show they were efficacious, the less it was possible to satisfy those requirements. And again, he says, towards the end of this, the pharmaceutical companies are withdrawing, despite the fact that there is huge medical need. Now, you would have thought, pharmaceutical companies, it's capitalism, of course, it's finance capitalism, of course, there are huge markets here. Vast markets here, if we believe the World Health Organization, and yet somehow these markets are not proving possible for the companies. It's not me or Roberto or Tullio or David Healy who has to demonstrate to you that the drugs don't do what they say they do. If you want to believe anybody, believe the people who are trying to make money out of them. It's not that no drugs are being developed for the central nervous system. So you can see this line that I've flagged up here. This is the CNS drug development pipeline, and you can see this is, these are cancer drugs. So it's second only for cancer drugs in the attempt of people to try and develop these drugs. But despite that fact, these drugs are not coming to the market. Again, this is Steve Hyman. Why? Because there are no validated molecular targets, because the animal work with the animal experiments doesn't work, because we don't understand what he calls the pathophysiology. We don't understand the pathophysiology of common psychiatric disorders. We don't have any objective tests. Our descriptive categories of diseases are completely useless. They're based on subjective rating scales. And the best recognized obstacles are, and I quote, the complexity of the brain and the associated challenge of connecting levels of analysis from molecules to cells to synapses to circuits and then to higher cognition, emotion regulation, and executive functioning. Tullio mentioned the book that I wrote with my colleague Joël Abi-Rached, was published last year, called Neuro. And in that book, we argued that there had been huge advances in our understanding of the brain at the molecular level. The so-called reductionist paradigm of experimental research in neurobiology led us to understand a huge amount about how individual neurons worked, about how cell membranes worked, about how ion channels work. We understand very well how individual neurons work. But what we understand almost not at all is how those neurons develop, how they connect with one another, how they function in circuits, how those circuits build into emergent properties at higher levels, how those emergent circuits at higher levels underpin higher mental functions, and how it is those higher mental functions that are disturbed in psychiatric disorders. So even if we had a brain-based hypothesis of psychiatric disorders, we simply do not understand the pathophysiology, we simply do not understand the functioning of the brain well enough to begin to turn that into effective explanations, let alone effective interventions. So of course, as I showed you, there is no let-up in the use of the drugs, but the dream that underpinned the use of the drugs, that we knew how they worked, because we knew what the problem was that they were treating, that dream, as I said, has at least stalled. Now, Steve Hyman who I respect greatly, he uses the word stalled. Stalled means you're going, and you've temporarily stopped. His view is that maybe in 10, in 15, in 20, in 30, in 50 years, we will know enough to begin to fire up the engine again and keep going. His view is that there is nothing wrong with the fundamental belief that psychiatric disorders are brain disorders, if only we could understand the brain well enough. This is really, these other slides that I'm showing you are simply demonstrating the same thing. I showed you actually that there were quite a lot of drugs in the pipeline, but the drugs that are in the pipeline are either, as Tullio said, the Me Too drugs, just slightly modified copies of other drugs, or else they're drugs that seem to show a potentially improved safety profile. If you compare these drugs to drugs for cancer, 5 years ago, the rate of development of these drugs with cancer drugs was pretty much equivalent. Now, these drugs, neuropsychiatric drugs, are being developed at only half the rate of cancer drugs. So the pipeline isn't healthy. There are some drugs that are being trialed. The so-called atypical psychotics are being trialed, but many dispute whether or not their mode of action is really different from the other psychotics. Many existing drugs are going out of patent. The costs of research and development are rising. Central nervous system drugs take longer to bring to market than any other drugs. They fail late. The animal models don't work, and therefore the drug companies are disinvesting. Well, that's a long way round of making that laborious point. Now, some argue that there is still a potential future here. In particular, better diagnosis. Better diagnosis by what's called hypothesis-free data collection. And I'll say a little bit about that in a moment. And this is the central argument that is being developed by people like Tom Insel at the National Institute of Mental Health. What is misleading, they argue, what is misleading is that our diagnostic system does not individuate diagnoses, does not individuate problems at the level of the brain. Our diagnostic system, when we say schizophrenia, when we say depression, when we say bipolar disorder, and when we're just working on the basis of the symptoms and the classification of the symptoms are misleading. And because the symptoms are misleading, these diagnoses lump together things that are very different at the level of their neurobiology. And that's the handicap. This is the argument that people like Insel make. That's the handicap. If only we could really identify the different disorders at the level of the brain itself, then we would understand the neurobiological mechanisms, and then we could target those neurobiological mechanisms. In other words, the problem is diagnosis. This, again, is Steve Hyman trying to argue that the problem here is diagnosis. And this, I think, shows you how people are beginning to understand the complexity of these issues. So this is what Hyman says. Common diseases represent families of diseases that share major pathophysiological and symptomatic features, but can differ in important ways. Similar symptoms can come from very different combinations of genetic risk factors, and the same gene variants may be associated with many different kinds of diagnoses in the DSM or in the ICD. Identification of common risk-conferring gene variants has proved extremely challenging because of their relatively small contribution to the disease phenotype and the diverse genetic, environmental, and other factors that lead to these common diseases. And again, Hyman, like Insel, argues, and indeed like Professor Giraldi, that there are no clear boundaries between ill and well. In other words, what we're looking at are complex variations along multiple dimensions that do not fit into clear boundaries and categories. Now, if only we could begin to identify those pathways those circuits, then some of our confusion would begin to fade away. Some of you may know that DSM-5, the latest edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, was published, well, now about getting on for a year ago. In the 10 years that led up to the publication of DSM-5, there was a huge investment of person-hours and of dollars to try and find biological markers for the different diseases that would enable people to make a diagnosis based on the biology. When DSM-5 was published, there was not a single clinically validated biological marker for any DSM condition. That is to say, it's impossible in a clinically relevant way to use biological markers to identify bipolar, to identify major depression, to identify schizophrenia. That whole attempt to find the biological bases of DSM categories, that whole attempt has proved to be a failure, despite the fact that it drove a huge movement towards an attempt to personalize medicine on the basis of biomarkers. So it was on that basis that, as Tullio mentioned in his introduction, Tom Insel argued that we needed a completely different strategy. And this was a bit of a bombshell, because those of you who know anything about clinical research in psychiatry will know that for many years the National Institute of Mental Health has only funded research in psychiatry if it uses categories based on the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. If you're doing a clinical trial on depression and you want to compare the effects of a drug on people with depression and people not with depression, you have to identify those cases using DSM. DSM depressives, not DSM non-depressives. DSM was not just a clinical set of guidelines, but it was also central to the whole way in which psychiatric research was to be done. Cases and controls had to be identified using DSM criteria. And as I say, vast amounts of money was expended in those kinds of clinical trials. So Tom Insel, who's a very friendly and approachable person, he writes a blog, about 6 months before the publication of the fifth edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, he announced on his blog that the National Institute of Mental Health will be reorienting its research away from DSM categories on the grounds that mental disorders are biological disorders involving brain circuits that implicate specific domains of cognition, emotion, or behavior, but they are not the categories that are identified in the DSM. So this was a huge bombshell suggesting that the whole organization of psychiatric research had to be transformed. You would no longer get money from the NIMH if you were going to recruit samples into your research using the categories of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. Instead, he suggested you should use another approach. What was this other approach? You should take everybody who came to a particular clinic. You should do genetic tests on everybody who came to a particular clinic. You should do brain imaging on everybody who came to a particular clinic. You should take life histories of everybody who came to a particular clinic. You should gather as much data as you could, and then you should try and analyze that data without just dividing up the people into depressives, anxieties, bipolars, schizophrenics, or whatever. You just take all this data, you throw it into a large computer, and you try and identify patterns. You try and identify patterns at the level of the brain that mapped on to patterns at the level of the symptoms. In other words, you would go to the brain itself rather than to the categories of DSM or anything else. You should go straight to the brain. Faced with the choice, as people like Insel were in 2012, they were faced with the choice of abandoning the diagnostic categories that had served them since 1980, or abandoning the belief that mental disorders were disorders of the brain, That was a fundamental choice point in the road, and faced with that choice, the National Institute of Mental Health decided to abandon DSM 3 months before it was published and say, we're going to go straight to the brain. Trust the brain, not trust DSM. I'm mainly a bureaucrat these days, but I do a little bit of research, and I'm involved in a thing called the Human Brain Project. Some of you may have heard of the Human Brain Project. The European Union is spending 1.3 billion euros over 10 years to produce a virtual brain, to build a virtual brain. This is a huge program with many, many scientists involved, but there's one part of it that's very close to the Tom Insel version of what should be done. I just want to explain to you how this new dream is taking shape. So you'll be aware, I'm sure, that in all the hospitals and clinics all over Europe, there's a vast amount of data on people with psychiatric disorders. There's family history data, there's clinical data, there's data on the effects of treatment, there are genetic tests, in some cases there are brain imaging, in some cases there are other tests, pathophysiological tests that have been done. These data lie passively in the case records across Europe, hundreds, thousands, perhaps millions of case records in thousands of European hospitals. Here's what the Human Brain Project wants to do in one part of its work. It wants to take all that data, it wants to put all that data together, and it wants to use huge computer programs to mine that big data to try and identify what they call brain signatures of psychiatric disorders. Let's not divide them up by diagnosis. Let's not divide them up by anything. Let's just throw all the data into the computer and let the computer try and identify the patterns. And then when the computer has identified the patterns, the algorithms, the brain signatures, then perhaps we can begin to see what the relationship is between what's going on in the brain and what's going on at the level of the experience of the individual itself. And once you've begun to do that, again, this is why it's part of this big Human Brain Project, perhaps you can even simulate those brain signatures in a huge supercomputer, in a neuromorphic computer, and try and model the interventions there. Let's not do animal models. Let's not base ourselves on DSM or ICD. Let us go straight to the brain. Now, there are many, many issues involved in federating all these data, as you can imagine. Many ethical issues about how you gain access to it, about how you maintain anonymity, and so on and so forth. But nonetheless, those are not, I'm happy to talk about those, but nonetheless, what I'm trying to suggest to you is that here is the new dream. The new dream that is taking shape is that you can maintain your belief that psychiatric disorders are fundamentally disorders of the brain. You have to abandon two things. On the one hand, you have to abandon Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, or the ICD, and on the other hand, you have to abandon your belief that the current generation of drugs target specifically the neuromolecular mechanisms of disorder. In other words, you abandon pretty much what's been the central theses of biological psychiatry over the last 30 years, and you go straight to the brain. What you maintain is the belief that a psychiatric disorder is ultimately grounded in the brain. Of course, not everybody has completely abandoned the belief, the old belief, that you can find psychiatric drugs based on the existing models that will directly target the underlying bases of neuropsychiatric disorders. Alzheimer's is perhaps the hugest target for the drug companies. If only they could develop drugs that would begin even to ameliorate the symptoms of Alzheimer's, let alone cure it, that certainly would be a massive, massive market. As we know, the global prevalence of dementia is rising and rising and rising. And you can see just some of these figures estimating the prevalence of dementia for those aged over 60 years in a whole range of different regions. I won't go into that now, and you can see here this is just an indication of the rate of growth of numbers of people with dementia in high-income countries. These are here, but also, perhaps more crucially, in lower and middle-income countries. This is here. Dementia is not a disorder that is going to be confined to the wealthy West. If anything, it's going to be more of a problem for the economies of the rising countries, the developing countries of China, of India, of Malaysia, where people are living longer and longer and longer, where there are fewer and fewer children, and where the economy and the health system is simply not set up in order to address those conditions. So you would have thought that the law of Alzheimer's, the possibility of this massive and growing market, would have underpinned a huge search for the drugs that were going to develop Alzheimer's. If you were going to capture anything, you were going to capture the dementias. But I'm afraid that the story of drugs for Alzheimer's is yet again a story of complete disappointment. Almost all the drugs in development for Alzheimer's have failed, despite huge hopes, despite huge investment. The drug companies have failed to use their existing understanding of molecular mechanisms in order to develop any effective intervention in the development of the dementias. It's commonly believed that dementias are linked to the amount of plaque and tangle in the brain, and yet you can produce a mouse model with as much plaque and tangle as you like, and it will not show dementia. Or you can use a plaque and tangle busting drug and it will not reduce the symptoms of an individual's dementia. So somehow, even in this most crucial of disorders, where we do seem to understand something about the brain mechanism, our ability to intervene in what must be a complex circuit disorder on the basis of our understanding of very simple markers of the pathophysiology has proved to be a failure. These are all the drugs, I won't go into this, these are all just an indication of the number of unsuccessful Alzheimer drugs that are in development. So we seem to be in a very problematic situation when it comes to psychopharmacology. Our existing models based on neurotransmission for common psychiatric disorders have proved to be a failure. Our existing drugs, even if they work at all, even if they're better at all than the drugs we developed in the 1950s and 60s, and that is dubious, certainly do not work in the way in which they claim to work and do not produce a massive reduction in symptomatology, even though they claimed that they would. We don't understand the pathways. We don't even know what we don't know. The more we know about the brain at the molecular level, the less we understand about these complex pathways. If you maintain the belief that a psychiatric disorder is a brain disorder, and that in order to develop effective therapies, you have to understand the brain basis of that disorder, then I think it is probably clear that the length of time between now and when we understand those disorders sufficiently to be able to intervene is probably 15, 20, 30, 40 years. And we might well say the belief that psychiatric disorders are brain-based disorders, or the belief that we have to understand the brain before we can have effective interventions, is at the very best a hypothesis. At the very best, it's a hypothesis that is driving research in the same way as the neurotransmitter hypothesis drove research. It took us 30 or 40 years before we realized that that hypothesis was a failure. I wonder how many years and how much investment it will take before we can see whether this new hypothesis is a success or a failure. Now there is, of course, another pathway, and perhaps I'll just conclude with a few words on that other pathway. Tullio showed us at the beginning these, I'm not quite sure what those things were, I didn't quite catch what those things were that were in the pictures that he showed at the beginning. But along with those pictures, I could have well shown you some pictures again from the 18th or the 19th century where people tried to cure mental disorders with electricity or magnetism. Electricity and magnetism. Can anything be so crude as to believe that through electricity or magnetism you can change the nature of the brain? But of course, that is exactly where another pathway of development is going. The popularity of deep brain stimulation and the use of deep brain stimulation is growing really exponentially. Deep brain stimulation, I'm sure you know, means implanting microelectrodes deep into the brain and stimulating specific areas of the brain with very small currents of electricity. It's not like electroconvulsive therapy, but it still tries to stimulate the brain through little bursts of electricity. Transcranial magnetic stimulation, using a magnet outside the brain to affect the neural circuits probably only about 2 or 3 millimeters deep into the brain because the magnetic changes in magnetic field don't penetrate that far. Transcranial direct current stimulation, using a helmet that puts some little stimulation of direct current, alternative current into the brain, and neural stem cells. These are the areas where one is beginning to see the companies that previously invested in drugs beginning to turn to the investment in devices. And you can just tour the internet and you can see a whole range of new devices based on this new belief that if the drugs have failed us, electricity and magnetism will certainly succeed. You can buy some of these yourself on the internet and try them at home if you like. Some people argue that deep brain stimulation is very, very effective for motor disorders. In fact, it's been used a lot for Parkinson's disease, and it seems to be pretty effective in relation to Parkinson's. But here's the strange thing. As well as removing the tremor in Parkinson's, deep brain stimulation often produces really quite radical transformations in personality, in desires, in impulses, pathological gambling, and a whole series of other kinds of things. People who experience deep brain stimulation for their Parkinson's often feel that they are transformed in ways that they don't quite understand when the stimulation is on, and often choose to do many of their tasks without that stimulation. Something is happening here. We have absolutely no idea of the mechanism. No idea of the mechanism. We don't even have a belief that we know the mechanism as we did with the drugs. The mode of action is unknown, the large-scale trials haven't been conducted, the regulation of these devices is very problematic, so will they be the next best hope? I was for 6 years a member of the UK's major bioethics body, the Nuffield Council on Bioethics, and we recently published a report on the social and ethical implications of these devices that go straight to the brain, which is, as I say, a growing market. But again, don't take my word. Perhaps you do better to take the word of DARPA, the Defense and Allied Research Project Association of the United States. The organization which, as it says down here at the bottom, for the creation and prevention of strategic surprise. DARPA, which funds almost every bizarre and terrifying invention that you might think of. So I mentioned the Human Brain Project. The Human Brain Project has committed itself to peaceful use only, to taking no money from the military and not developing military applications. Some of you may know that there's an American brain project funded by a whole range of sources, which is a kind of equivalent of that, and that's the one that Tom Insel is very involved in. The American Brain Project is funded about 40% by the Defense and Allied Research Project, DARPA in other words, funded by the military. And the military has become extremely interested, not in the use of drugs, not in the use of psychopharmacology, but in the development of brain-computer interfaces to control feelings. That is to say, implants into the brain that stimulate various regions of the brain that can be accessed remotely and can be used either to enhance or to limit feelings, impulses, and desires. I won't read this all out because I'm coming very much to the end of my time. But here we begin to see another model of the way in which moods and desires and feelings and impulses can be controlled. Now, I'm sure you're not all devotees of searching the internet, but if you do search the internet and you put into your Google search the name José Delgado, you'll find something very interesting. José Delgado, a Spanish neuroscientist, working in the 1950s and the 1960s, initially became interested in the use of frontal lobotomies, actually physically intervening into the brain in order to remove some areas of the brain or cut some circuits in the brain. And he was absolutely appalled by the crudity and, as he saw it, the cruelty of these direct interventions into the brain. And he began experimenting with a mode of intervention into the brain that he felt was less crude, less cruel, and more precise. He developed mechanisms with small implants into the brains of, initially of animals, where he would give small targeted stimulation, electrical stimulation to the brain of these animals, monkeys and others. And he showed that using these small stimulators to the brains of these animals, he could control their fear, he could elicit or control lust, desire, aggression, and a whole series of other kinds of things in these creatures. There's a classic movie which you will see if you roam the internet of José Delgado in a bull ring in Cordoba in Spain, using his stimoceiver to control the rage of a bull as it rushes towards him. And the bull rushes towards him, and then he stimulates the brain, and the bull drops its head and kneels down in submission to him. He wrote a book, rather controversial book, called Towards a Psycho-Civilized Society. Became mired in scandal, he gave it up. I'm not saying that we're moving towards a psycho-civilized society, but what I am suggesting to you is that in the failure of psychopharmacology to live up to its promises and to live up to its premises, a whole series of other novel developments to try and manage human mood, human impulses, human desires, human affects are beginning to take shape. Whether these kinds of devices, these kinds of interventions can ever achieve the huge scope that we saw psychopharmacology has done, 53 million prescriptions in in England, millions and millions and millions living their lives shaped by these drugs, I don't know. Does psychopharmacology have a future? I find it hard, as I said right at the beginning, to imagine that however much we roll out psychological therapies, however much we roll out CBT, however much we roll out bibliotherapy and so on, we will begin to reverse the tide in which so many people have become so dependent on the use of these drugs. But we can be certain that the hypothesis, the experimental systems, the explanations that initially underpinned these drugs no longer hold water. So if we're using these drugs, it's not because we know how they work. It's not because we know how they cure people. It's not even because we know that they work at the level other than the level of the chemical kosh. They work to manage behavior, and that's all they do. And I think at that point, I'm going to stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick, for this exceptional, I should say, lecture. lecture, and we may organize now what is going on. Possiamo organizzarci per quello che facciamo con una serie di domande da prima al professor Rose. Penso che ci saranno molte domande, visto che gli argomenti che ha trattato sono abbastanza intriganti, particolarmente il ruolo della mente, del cervello, dei meccanismi dei farmaci. Poi naturalmente gli esperti presenti saranno ben voluti se vorranno alla fine di questa prima fase di discussione fare dei commenti più integrati sulla base di tutto quello che è successo. Quindi prego con le domande. Prego. L'unica cosa, facciamo circolare un microfono così è possibile le traduzioni simultanee. Grazie. Sì.
Grazie. Volevo precisare, DARPA ha sviluppato un dispositivo che praticamente consente, mediante delle